Today we are looking at a case from the first part of the 20th century. So sit back as we first go to India before moving on to England and Scotland. Buck Ruxton was born on the 21st of March 1899 in the Indian city of Bombay, which today is known as Mumbai. When he was born, he was named Bukhtiar Rustomji Hakim, but he later changed his name to Buck Ruxton. At the time, India was part of the British Empire. His family were relatively wealthy, and this enabled him to have a good education. He was a very intelligent child and was dedicated to his studies. When he finished his schooling, he went on to study medicine at the University of Bombay, from which he graduated in 1922. He then started to work in a local hospital, where he specialised in medicine and gynecology. Following this, he moved on to the Indian Medical Service. Things were going well for him. The marriage, however, was arranged and did not last. Buck was anxious to enhance his medical knowledge, so travelled first to England to study at London's University College Hospital, before moving to Scotland to study a postgraduate course. Here he obtained a fellowship of the Royal College of Surgeons. It was at this time that he changed his name to Buck Ruxton. While studying in Scotland, he met a young lady named Isabella Kerr. She was 26 years old and worked in a cafe which Buck would often visit. They began courting, and their relationship soon became serious. He did not mention that he was still married to a lady in India, and Isabella did not talk about the fact that she had actually married a few years earlier. But as the marriage only lasted a few months, she had reverted back to using her maiden name of Kerr. She was in fact still married. In 1928, Buck was offered work as a doctor in London, and accompanied by Isabella, travelled from Scotland to take up his new position. It was an exciting time for the couple, and a year later in 1929, Isabella gave birth to their daughter, who they named Elizabeth. They did not stay in London for very long, and 2 years later travelled north to the town of Lancaster in the county of Lancashire. They moved to 2 Dalton Square, where Buck established his own practice. The practice soon grew, and the patients regarded him as a compassionate and hard-working doctor. Both he and Isabella became popular members of the local community. The couple had another daughter in 1931, who they named Diana, and this was followed in 1933 by a son who they named William. It seemed they had the perfect life and were the perfect family, but the demands on Isabella were starting to show. She was busy with the children and helping to run a busy doctor's practice, and Buck could be called out to see a patient at any time. So in order to make things a bit easier, they employed a live-in housekeeper. She was a 19-year-old young lady named Mary Jane Rogerson. Despite the perception that they were a contented, hard-working family and pillars of the local community, things were not quite as they seemed. The couple often argued, and neighbours would hear them shouting at each other. Occasionally, Isabella would take the children and return to Edinburgh. She would stay there for a few days before Buck called her and pleaded that she return, which she always did. But the arguments continued. Buck would accuse Isabella of infidelity, and on occasions, the arguments were so loud and hostile that the neighbours called the police. In one incident in 1933, Isabella called the police herself, telling them that Buck had beaten her. The police investigated, but the claims were never substantiated, and there were no charges ever issued. When Isabella attended social functions, she would often be seen in the company of a gentleman named Robert Edmondson. Buck had always had his suspicions that Robert and Isabella were conducting some kind of illicit relationship behind his back. This was one of the reasons that the couple continually argued. At the beginning of September 1935, Isabella went to Edinburgh to visit one of her sisters. Robert also made the journey and stayed in the same hotel, although they booked into separate rooms. She returned a few days later. On the 14th of September, she went to the northwest coastal town of Blackpool to see the illuminations, which is an annual lights festival. She'd arranged to meet 2 of her sisters there. It was a short trip from her home in Lancaster to Blackpool, and she told Buck that she would be back later that evening. However, she did not return to her home at 2 Dalton Square. until the early hours of Sunday the 15th of September. Buck had not gone to bed. He was not happy that Isabella was out so late, and when she returned, he again accused her of being with Robert Edmondson. While Isabella was in Blackpool, Buck had told one of the ladies who helped his wife around the house not to come in the next day, but to wait until Monday the 16th. On the Sunday, he also made a point of visiting the other helper, a lady named Agnes Oxley, and he told her not to come to work until Monday. He then drove the short distance to Morecambe and asked a friend who was a dentist if he and his wife would be able to look after the children for a while. He told everyone that he needed to prepare, as his house was going to be decorated. At 4:30 in the afternoon, he visited the home of a patient named Mrs. Hampshire. He asked that she and her husband come to his house and help him prepare for the start of decorating. He told her that he needed help, as he had cut his hand while trying to open a tin of fruit. When Mr. and Mrs. Hampshire arrived at Dalton Square, they were surprised. Mrs. Hampshire did not think that the house would be in such a bad way. Many of the carpets had been removed, rolled up, and placed in rooms or in the garden. Flooring was missing, and some areas were covered with straw. There were also burned towels outside in the backyard. Despite this, the Hampshires did their best to help. Later in the evening, when they were ready to leave, Dr. Ruxton asked them to take some rolled up stair carpets and requested that Mrs. Hampshire clean it. When she later unrolled it, she thought that the strange marks were probably bloodstains. Mrs. Oxley returned to 2 Dalton Square on Monday the 16th, and she continued to work there throughout the week. The doctor told her that Isabella had in fact left him for another gentleman. She felt something was not quite right, as doors were locked upstairs, and the doctor was spending much time burning things in the yard. Dr. Buck Ruxton, however, did continue with his routine. He worked in his practice and he visited his patients, but soon people started to realise that they had not seen Isabella or the housekeeper, Mary Jane Rogerson. 2 weeks later, on the morning of Sunday the 29th of September 1935, a decomposing human arm was found by the banks of a stream near the small town of Moffat in Scotland. The police searched the area, a search that was then widened to include the nearby ravines and the Annan River. Following the search, more body parts were found. They were all wrapped in clothes, sheets, pillowcases and newspaper. The body parts were taken to the Moffat mortuary, where it was concluded that they had belonged to 2 females of different heights and ages, and that the person who had dismembered them must have had extensive anatomical knowledge. It was going to be very difficult to identify the deceased, as all identifiable body parts, such as teeth and scars, had been removed. It was concluded that the bodies would have been placed in the water at around the 17th of September. The police also thought that the person who had put them there was not familiar with the area and may have travelled from the south, possibly from England. The pathologist informed the detectives that one of the deceased was a female, aged from 30 to 55, but probably between 35 and 45, and the second was a female aged between 18 and 25, but more likely aged between 20 and 21. A significant discovery followed when a hand was recovered, from which the police were able to obtain a set of fingerprints. They were surprised, as the person responsible had been so meticulous in their efforts to make identification almost impossible. The investigators looked at the newspaper in which some of the body parts had been wrapped. One of the papers was called the Sunday Graphic. This was distributed nationally, but this particular copy was a special edition and had only been circulated in the Lancaster area. Inspector Jeremiah Lynch of Scotland Yard was sent to assist with the investigation. He searched the missing person records for the period from the 15th of September, but his efforts in identifying the victim was unsuccessful. Although Buck Ruxton's common-law wife and his housekeeper were missing, he had not formally reported this. He had only told the police that Isabella had once again deserted him. He also told the parents of the housekeeper that their daughter had become pregnant and that his wife had arranged for her to have a termination, something that was illegal at the time. He said that she would be back when she had recovered, not convinced that he was telling the truth. Mr. and Mrs. Rogerson filed a missing persons report on the 2nd of October. 2 days later, Dr. Buck Ruxton also officially reported Isabella as missing. On the 9th of October, Scottish police visited Lancaster. They spoke to Mr. and Mrs. Rogerson, who were able to identify a blouse, which had been used to wrap body parts, as one which had belonged to their daughter. There was also a pair of child shorts that a good friend of Isabella, named Edith Holm, confirmed had belonged to the Ruxton children. She was certain of this, as she had bought them as a gift the previous summer. The police also discovered that no one had seen Isabella or Mary Jane since the 15th of September. Rumours started to circulate that Dr. Buxton was responsible for the crime. It started to affect his practice, as some of his patients started to go elsewhere. Others, however, remained loyal to him and considered that the kind and caring doctor could not have committed such a terrible act. Concerned for his livelihood and reputation, he told the police that they need to search his house and eliminate him from their inquiries, as it wasn't fair that people were saying all these things about him. The police continued to investigate. The two ladies who helped in the house told them that on Monday the 16th of September, the house was in a terrible state, with carpets removed, burned linen in the yard, and the bath was discoloured. They had been instructed to clean it. Dr. Ruxton was eventually arrested on the 12th of October, but he denied any involvement in the disappearance of his common-law wife Isabella and his housekeeper Mary Jane. The police asked him how it was that on the 17th of September, a car with his registration plates was seen in the market town of Kendal, 30 miles from Lancaster, when a cyclist was knocked off his bicycle. They said that he may have been driving from his home to Moffat, where he planned to dispose of the body parts. They also told him that they had found bloodstains in his home and traces of human fat and body tissue. Fingerprints found at the house also matched those of the younger hand found in Scotland that was believed to belong to Mary Jane. On the 13th of October, Dr. Buck Ruxton was charged with the murder of his housekeeper, Mary Jane Rogerson. He emphatically proclaimed his innocence. 3 weeks later, on the 5th of November, forensic experts identified one of the skulls found to be Isabella Kerr. They had managed to do this by using a new forensic technique where an X-ray of a skull was superimposed onto a photo of a person who they believed to be the deceased. The same process later matched the photo of the skull of Mary Jane Rogerson. While this technique had not been proven, it was considered groundbreaking and a major forensic advancement at the time. Dr. Buck Ruxton was then charged with the murder of Isabella Kerr. On Monday the 2nd of March 1936, the trial of Dr. Buck Ruxton began at the High Court in the city of Manchester. The prosecution claimed that Dr. Ruxton had committed the murders, as he believed that his common-law wife was seeing another gentleman, and in a jealous rage had killed Isabella. He then murdered Mary Jane, as she had witnessed the crime. In order to try and cover up what he had done, he dismembered the bodies and dumped them more than 100 miles away in the Garden Home Lynn stream in the southern uplands of Scotland. The defence claimed that the bodies were not in fact Isabella Kerr and Mary Jane Rogerson, and suggested that the evidence presented did not prove otherwise. They also claimed that the bloodstains found in the house were ones that you would expect when the house was used as a doctor's surgery. Every witness was cross-examined, and the defence was very thorough in their questioning, especially with the forensic experts. Many prosecution witnesses were called, mainly people who had seen the defendant on the days preceding and following the 15th and 16th of September. However, the defence themselves only called one witness, and that was the defendant, Dr. Buck Ruxton, and he proved to be a poor witness. He had bouts of hysteria, cried, and was unable to concisely answer the questions put to him. He kept to the story that Isabella had travelled to Edinburgh with the housekeeper. He also denied that his relationship with Isabella was strained, and that they often argued. In the closing arguments, the defence counsel reminded the jury that the evidence presented by the prosecution was all circumstantial, and that it was not for the defence to prove the defendant innocent, but for the prosecution to prove him guilty which they believed they had failed to do. On the 13th of March, the jury retired to consider the verdict. An hour later they returned to find the defendant, Buck Ruxton, guilty, and the judge sentenced him to death. The verdict was appealed. The defence stated that the vehicle used to supposedly have transported two dismembered bodies had no traces of soil or blood. They argued that the judge had not given this enough weight when summing up the case. The appeal was dismissed. A petition in Lancaster was started and gained over 6,000 signatures, but a new trial was not granted and the sentence was not commuted. Dr. Buck Ruxton was executed at Strangeways Prison in Manchester on the 12th of May 1936. He was buried in an unmarked grave in the grounds of the prison. The day after the execution, a Sunday newspaper published a brief handwritten confession where Dr. Ruxton confessed that he had murdered Isabella in a jealous rage, but as he was interrupted by the housekeeper, he killed her as well. The torso of Mary Jane Rogerson was never found. It is believed that it must have flowed out to sea. It is thought that the Ruxton children, Elizabeth, Diane and William, were all brought up in an orphanage. Hello everyone, thank you so much for listening. As you know, I value your comments and feedback, and I hope to see you all again in the next brief case.